it's the gospel of grace. And he's
Grace.
The spirit of grace, that through the grace of Christ, the grace gave us grace, given grace, and we continue on in grace, having received it. And it wasn't by
So,
merit that we received grace, otherwise it would have been something we merited, but it was
Right.
the grace of God. It's the one who gave us grace to start with, continues to give us grace. We see being given full grace, and then as they mature, still knowing that fullness of grace, and it's because God is gracious. That grace suddenly, gospel of grace is that grace is the gospel of grace.
Because
Grace was given
that's
after
also
grace. So grace
let's
was
go to.
given after grace. They were saved by grace. A new grace. No, there isn't a new grace. This grace was accomplished before the beginning, and it is the holy and all sufficient grace of God. Grace for us, to grace. Then they have fallen from grace, and grace is no longer
What,
of any use to
so
them.
help me on.
Covenant of grace, or that grace somehow becomes a different grace, God's grace. Grace was given upon
God,
grace. This is
is that you're referring to the book of John, right? And you're saying, look, that's it's grace upon grace, right? Is grace and truth came through Jesus Christ, but grace came through Jesus Christ.
his grace is proclaimed. Does grace need a grace that God accomplished? If it needed to be modified, would have been imperfect. But the grace that he accomplished is perfect, and the imperfection of sorry, I've kind of
no. I'm listening though.
I've kind of lost my thread. Excuse me. May the Lord be
It's okay.
gracious with me. But my point being is that the grace that is extended to both isn't that grace has to change, but grace is it is grace. It's rid of name that grace we've received grace. It is
Grace of Christ, avoiding the grace of God,